Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow?
Hey guys, welcome to Culture Shock, your hub for lists, media, and occasional social commentary. In this video, the first in a retrospective series reviewing classic video games, we're looking at Bioshock, the acclaimed first-person shooter developed and published by 2K Studios. Originally released on the Xbox 360 and PC in 2007, it would eventually find its way on the PlayStation 3 and on current-gen consoles in remastered form. Now, to determine what makes Bioshock, and every other game that we will feature in this series for that matter, truly essential, we're going to conduct a deep analysis of the game, breaking down its various components and seeing how they work together in cohesion to make it a classic title. These components will include, but will not be limited to, presentation and atmosphere, gameplay, pacing, visual design, sound design, and immersion. A common trait among classic games is how the experience as a whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and there is no better example of this than Bioshock. While its individual components are impressive in and of themselves, it's the combination of these elements, particularly Bioshock's setting, immersion, and audio, that make it both an incredible game and a totally unique experience. The best place to begin dissecting Bioshock's various parts, though, has to be the game's setting, Rapture. Built in the 1940s under the Atlantic Ocean, Rapture's creator, Andrew Ryan, envisioned it as a safe haven for exceptional people, free from the morality and constraints of the world to pursue and excel in the fields of the arts and of the sciences. However, it becomes immediately evident that this utopia quickly dissolved into a hellish dystopia, because after an iconic introduction, which sees the player take a submarine from the surface to the underwater city, complete with the propagandist voiceover of Ryan himself, lauding what a wonderful place Rapture is, we're greeted with a crumbling shell of a city within minutes of starting the game. Rapture is one of the greatest settings in video game history. From the moment you enter the city, it completely isolates and immerses you in its world, creating a palpable sense of tension for the player, while simultaneously making them want to explore every nook and cranny of it. One of the biggest reasons for this is the atmosphere. The city of Rapture establishes a mood from the get-go that stays consistent for the entire playthrough. Its Art Deco style and dark moody colour palette give it a visual effect that is all its own. The music from the 1940s and 50s, and the commercials, which propagandise the city and advertise its various products, play over loudspeakers throughout the game, establishing both Rapture's fictional setting and its time in real-life history perfectly. Rapture as a location, as an entity, as an unfolding story, and as a failed experiment permeate every aspect of Bioshock, including all the other points we're going to discuss in this video. It's that powerful and ever-present. Just as important as the city itself is its fall from grace and descension into its current ruinous state. We know that it failed completely, but why? Again, keeping things light on the spoiler front, and with a story this good and integral to the game, there is a lot to spoil. We know almost from the beginning that the biggest contributing factor to Rapture's downfall was Adam, a genetic material discovered and mass-produced in Rapture that alters the genetic code of the user, giving them superhuman abilities. Why this is so important, aside from the reason that Rapture fell to pieces, is that in order to survive and progress your journey throughout the city, you must use this substance yourself to put you on an even playing field with your enemies, the Splicers. Splicers were regular citizens of Rapture who got hooked on Adam, the effects of which altered them physically and psychologically to the point that they now more closely resemble monsters than humans. Ergo, one of the most vital aspects of the story also becomes one of the most vital aspects of the gameplay. Which is just as well, because using these newly acquired powers, referred to as plasmids, is an absolute blast. These powers include the ability to shoot fire or lightning from your hands, set cyclone traps for oncoming enemies, and even summon a swarm of bees to attack the Splicers. All of these can be used in conjunction with the game's weapons. While not as inspired as the plasmids, the weapons themselves are good and an important part of the game. Better still, all of these weapons can be upgraded, and some have more than one ammo type. This means that a shotgun, upgraded to be more powerful and filled with explosive rounds that cause enemies to burst into flames, is significantly more effective than a regular buck round fired from a gun minus the upgrade. Using certain weapons and plasmid combos against certain enemies in certain areas, an example of which may be lighting a splicer on fire with a flamethrower beside a body of water, and when said splicer jumps into the water, hitting him with the electro bolt plasmid to finish him off, adds a tactical element to the game and is one of its many highlights. The plasmids too can be upgraded, but you cannot do this simply with money. Purchasing and upgrading them requires the aforementioned Atom. Atom is acquired through either harvesting or saving little sisters, genetically modified toddlers who were engineered to harvest and carry the material. Choosing to either harvest or save them has an effect on the overall story arc. However, this effect isn't quite as dramatic as you may have been led to believe. Again, we're not going to delve too deeply into spoiler territory here, but this is one of the few elements of the game that doesn't work in the end, which we will address before the video is out. You don't get to decide the fate of these small Atom carriers, however, until you take out their protectors, the Big Daddies. Armour-clad, drill and turret-wielding behemoths who are incredibly powerful and can soak up a ton of ammunition before finally going down for good. The first time facing one of these hulking monsters is a genuinely tense moment, a feeling equalled only by the elation and satisfaction you feel after beating them using your newly acquired plasmids and weapons. There are two types of Big Daddies: Rosies, who shoot the aforementioned turrets at you as well as proximity mines, and the drill-wielding bouncers, the much more intimidating, much cooler looking, and much more powerful and quicker of the two. Admittedly, once you've taken down 4 or 5 of these bosses, you stumble across patterns of attack that render the remaining encounters more pedestrian, even if you are incentivized to take them down to gain access to the Atom you need to beef up your plasmids. So, now that we've established the premise, the mechanics, and your general purpose for engaging with the world around you, how does the story play out, and how good is it to explore the city of Rapture? The answer is it plays out well, and exploring it is absolutely amazing. We touched briefly on Rapture as a setting and its backstory, but how these two work and unfold in conjunction with one another, and how they sprawl out and develop as you progress through the game, is just as impressive as your introduction to both. Rapture, and by proxy the game itself, can be divided up into roughly 9 different sections or levels. Almost every level is brilliant, which is a testament to the game level design, immersion, and overall pacing. Immersion and pacing to me are the two most important elements of any story-driven game, and you will hear me harp on about these two things in future game reviews also. And in Bioshock, the only dip in quality really occurs at the very end of the game, which we will discuss in a few minutes. So, what keeps the player so immersed over the course of Bioshock's roughly 15-hour campaign? Again, there isn't one answer to this question, and it's these various elements working symbiotically together which makes it work so well. Each level shares a similar vibe and general aesthetic design. However, they all have their own unique layouts, enemies, and mission objectives that make them stand out from one another and keeps the player interested. To exemplify this, I'm going to compare and contrast my two favourite sections of the game, the Medical Pavilion and Fort Frolic. Both areas need to be traversed in order to progress to the next portion of the game. Both have final bosses, both of which are batshit crazy, that need to be confronted to access the batospheres that take you to these next sections. Both contain a smorgasbord of enemies and Big Daddies that need to be taken out to survive and get stronger respectively, and both have that signature dark, Bioshocky vibe. All that said, how these levels play out are very different. For one, the Medical Pavilion is, well, a medical pavilion. In it, you come across morgues filled with dead bodies which may or may not actually be dead, and may or may not actually scare the crap out of you. You'll discover abandoned dental practices which eerily fill with smoke upon entry, and other sections which are thematically similar. The man you have to find is Dr. Steinman, a malpracticing plastic surgeon who disfigured and killed his patients on an atom-filled power trip, who lost his mind around the same time I imagine he lost his license to practice. In order to get him and get the key off him, which grants you access to the next batosphere, you need to acquire 2 new plasmids, the fire-shooting incinerate and telekinesis, in order to get through certain ice and debris covered pathways. The boss itself is a relatively straightforward affair. Steinman is armed only with a machine gun and uses no plasmids himself, so it's basically just a straight up shootout. You also have no direct contact with Steinman until your confrontation with him near the end of the level. Instead, you learn about him almost entirely from your radio conversations with Atlas, one of your only companions who communicates with you via said radio, and the audio diaries you pick up periodically throughout the game. Okay, tangent time. Remember how I praised the sound design at the beginning of the video? The most important component of this comes in the form of these audio diaries. Littered throughout the game, they're recorded by Rapture's various citizens, including all the bosses, Andrew Ryan, and other characters who you get acquainted with only through these audio logs, most of which are dead before you even set foot in Rapture. It's such a clever and engaging way to progress the story in a passive manner, and going around, finding, and listening to them is one of the best parts of the experience. Okay, tangent over. Now let's look at Fort Frolic. Coming at the midway point of the story, it is, for my money, the highlight in a game filled with great moments. The previously discussed medical pavilion section, which takes place near the start of the game, acts almost as a continuation of a tutorial level in some respects, with the player's introduction to two of the game's fundamental plasmids, as well as their first encounter with a Big Daddy, all occurring here. Conversely, by the time you've reached Fort Frolic, you've already acquired most of the basic plasmids and weapons, and have probably slain at least half a dozen Big Daddies, meaning you're already familiar with the game's mechanics. The boss in this level, an artist and director named Sander Cohen, is also completely at odds with Steinman. Steinman doesn't communicate directly with our nameless protagonist at all, and only acknowledges him once as an ugly intruder, addressing all of this to the corpses of his patients, I might add. Cohen, on the other hand, makes contact with you directly, and in fact cuts your radio communication with everyone else so that he has your undivided attention, and radios you frequently with information about himself, his enemies, and with comments of sexually charged admiration towards you. While Steinman is completely deranged and doesn't really know or care who you are, Cohen watches you like a hawk, symbolised by a spotlight that tails you throughout the level's more open sections, and comments on every major thing you do, and even a few minor things. This also allows us to gauge his personality, that of an egomaniacal control freak and homicidal maniac, much quicker. And while there are interesting audio diaries of him scattered throughout the level, these act only to flesh out a character we already understand pretty well. Whereas with Steinman, we learn almost everything about him through these diaries. Cohen is crazy, yeah, but unlike the Good Doctor, he is aware of what's going on around him, and is succinct, making him a much different character to deal with. He's also directly involved with your progression through the level. He too prevents you from accessing a bathysphere to the next level, but how you gain access to this bathysphere is completely different. With Steinman, you merely had to kill him and take a key. Getting access to him was the challenge. In Fort Frolic, you have to go around killing and then photographing former quote-unquote disciples of Cohen who, in the process, adopts you willingly or otherwise as a sort of protege. In the medical pavilion, the environment controlled where you could and could not go, with Steinman being completely oblivious to your movements. In Fort Frolic, Cohen, a man that could allow you to leave at any moment, controls you and your actions directly, much like someone would an actor in a play. Even the end of both levels, minor spoiler alert, do, or I should say can, play out very differently. While killing Steinman is mandatory to progress the game, once you complete all the tasks for Cohen, he grants you access to the bathysphere and does not engage you in combat. The player can simply walk away from him and continue the game without killing him. And even if the player decides to take him out, Cohen as a boss relies entirely on plasmids, the polar opposite of Steinman, whose only form of attack is the gun he wields. And this leads us to our final point about Bioshock, and that is exploration and secondary character development. One of the best and most crucial aspects of the game is that even when you're not engaged in battles with splicers, Big Daddies, or has-been stage directors, exploring the game world passively is just as enthralling and, in many ways, some of the best and most immersive parts of the game. Finding quiet rooms in the game with an audio diary in it and a new ammo type or weapon upgrade station simultaneously acts as some of the finest moments and serves as a reminder that Bioshock is more of an experience than a sequence of levels and events. With all that said, what are some of the more negative elements of the game? Now, in Bioshock, like every classic game I will review, the good heavily outweighs whatever bad there may be, but still, no game is perfect. Some minor issues are things like repetition and hacking cameras and enemy turrets. While doing this adds another degree of tactical sophistication to enemy encounters, the minigame which is required to do this can grow a bit tiresome. I don't mind these so much myself, but many gamers find them a bit tedious. Also, there is huge repetition with enemy splicer NPCs. While there are multiple splicer types that keep the game interesting, Bioshock recycles the same, say, dumb-sounding thug or bougie or transatlantic lady across all these variants. What's even more inexplicable is that at the very beginning of the game, we're confronted by a splicer with a thick Northern English accent, but all the remaining splicers have the same 3 or 4 American dialects. Now, I'm not going to go all SJW on your asses and call for more diversity in the game. If all the characters are white Americans, that's fine with me. But they should have added a little bit more variety in a game that doesn't have, say, Grand Theft Auto or Elder Scrolls size amounts of NPCs, instead of just throwing in a random tyke for the sake of it. These are just minor issues, however, and detract very little from the overall experience. Bioshock's biggest flaw is the game's ending. I'm not going to spoil anything major here, although feel free to skip ahead anyway if you want to be completely surprised. Saying that Bioshock's conclusion is disappointing is a bit like saying that Grand Theft Auto 5 sold a few copies. Literally everything leading up to the game's final boss is brilliant, and while it could be argued that the final section of the game isn't quite as good as what came before it, it's still a blast and significantly better than the content of most other games. The final boss fight is so at odds with other encounters in the game, both in terms of gameplay and mood. While the other ones played like encounters with one of Rapture's citizens, albeit ones overpowered with excessive atom abuse or protective armour, the final boss looks, acts and plays out like an exaggerated comic book villain, which makes it feel separate from the other game as a whole and detaches the player from the experience he or she had up until that point being completely immersed in. Its structure too, a repetitive 4-part sequence, is beyond conventional and is, quite frankly, just dull. And what happens when the boss is over? What is the big payoff to a game that relied on its excellent storytelling, that puts so much stock in the morality choices of dealing with the little sisters in a merciful or merciless manner? You get a minutes long cutscene which is, quite frankly, absolute bollocks. To put it into perspective, it'd be like if you pitched a perfect game in baseball for 8 innings, and in the 9th inning you decided to walk off the mound, walk into your dressing room, and shove the ball in your personal catcher's mitt. It literally feels like the developers completely ran out of time and money, and had 45 minutes to write an ending, program the boss fight, and develop the last cutscene. It feels completely rushed and beyond underwhelming. All of which is a shame, because had they come up with a better ending, which in fairness they did for Bioshock 2, its much less loved, much less acclaimed, and mostly inferior sequel, Bioshock would be a practically flawless game. All of that negativity, however, doesn't take away from Bioshock as an entire body of work, because 98% of the experience is absolutely incredible. More than a first-person shooter, more than an action game with sci-fi elements, Bioshock is an interactive work of art which, when taken as a whole, as I mentioned at the start of the video, is much greater than the sum of its parts. As immersive as any game you're likely to play, with incredible pacing and a spin on the first-person shooter genre so ingenious that calling it an FPS game doesn't even feel right. Bioshock is an experience, and if you haven't played it yet, I suggest hopping in the submarine and taking a stroll through the city of Rapture. You won't regret it. Just be sure to bring your wrench with you. So that's it, guys. For more analysis, lists and general banter, keep it at Culture Shock.
What's this, goddess? An intruder! He's ugly! 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 Ugly!